We are in Daniel chapter 12. It is the longest chapter in the book. Just kidding. It's really short. It's 13 verses long. And so, really, this chapter is a little bit of a... It really just does resolve the end of the story. And so, just to remind you where we're at the very end. Right? First 6 chapters are stories about Daniel and his friends. Final 6 chapters are visions that Daniel received. So, the first half of the book, Daniel is the interpreter, right? He is the one who is interpreting other people's dreams and visions. Whereas in the final 6 chapters, it is somebody speaking to Daniel, and they are interpreting the dreams and visions for him, right? So they're the ones that he himself received. Chapters 2 through 7 were in Aramaic. That means chapter 7 is kind of like the bridge chapter, where it is the final chapter in the Aramaic section towards the Gentiles, but it's also the first chapter in the vision section, which takes up the last half of the book. And so for that reason, we would say that chapter is kind of central. And that makes sense because that chapter really culminates in 2 primary things. On one hand, you've got this one like a son of man who rides on the clouds of heaven and receives an eternal dominion. And that seems to be the hope that Daniel is placing both upon the Jewish people and the Gentiles, right? Because this is still the Aramaic section. At the same time, the thing that Daniel is more disturbed by in that chapter is this little horn that is rising up from the 4th beast. And he has no idea what's going on about that. And quite fittingly, when you go into chapters 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12, you do have that recurring theme of there being this little horn or this adversarial figure who seems to be directly opposed to God's kingdom program. And really against this whole Son of Man figure. The Son of Man figure only shows up in Daniel chapter 7, but based on the way that this other figure appears in the book, he does seem to be like diametrically opposed to everything God is doing. Which leads us to the final section where we are at right now, chapters 10 through 12 is... come on in! Hang on. Somebody might have looked for. Chapters 10 through 12 cover the final section of the book. And...
Noah's locked. Okay.
Hey, Eric. Yeah, so chapters 10 through 12 cover the final section of the book, and is really just one big long vision. Chapter 10 is more of an introduction to the vision. Chapter 11 is the meat of the vision itself. And chapter 12 is really the conclusion to it, which we're going to cover today. And just another way to look at this, where we were at for the last 2 weeks was chapter 11, which we talked about how the structure of it's very odd. Because verses 1 through 35 are very clearly talking about really like 400 years of history. And it is the most detailed prophecy in the entire Bible, not just the book of Daniel. To where, as a historian, you can look at it and you can just be like, oh, we clearly know what these events are. But once you get to verse 36 and onwards, it gets really weird. To where it's hard to discern what exactly is being talked about here. Are these verses still dealing with Antiochus Epiphanes? Are they dealing with another king? We didn't even talk about this last week, but some people theorize that it's talking about Herod the Great. But most people would lean towards this being some final Antichrist type figure who would correspond to the little horn that we saw in previous chapters. But ultimately, it's really hard to say because those verses are very strange, and there is textual reason to suggest that there might be a gap in between verse 35 and 36, like chronological gap, in a very similar way to what we saw in chapter 9 whenever we were talking about the 70 weeks. And so the main reason I wanted to emphasize a lot of this again is because I just want to remind you that Daniel's a hard book to understand. We are dealing with some of the most difficult chapters in the entire Bible. And after we finish Daniel, we're going into Ezekiel, and I'd like to tell you that it's going to get easier, but Ezekiel has a lot of really tricky stuff too. And so this time period in biblical history is just, it's very confusing things. And I think that kind of reflects how the Jewish people feel at that time. I think they feel very confused because they are currently living in exile, but they are still a nation in the eyes of God, and they're going to come back. And I think that how God is interacting with them kind of reflects where they're at in history. But these are weird, and so I just say all this to just remind us to be humble in how we interpret this. because I do see a lot of people who get very dogmatic and they think that they know exactly what every single verse means. And I think it's possible that some people could be correct. But I think that it's better to err on the side of caution and explore different interpretations, and also just try to figure out the base meaning of what the text is saying, so that, if these are talking about future events, well, if we're alive to see them happen, we want to be humble enough to be able to identify it when it's taking place. Because we talked about this a little bit in chapter 11, and it's going to come up again in chapter 12, but there is this idea throughout Scripture about, like it'll repeatedly say that in the last days knowledge will increase. And people debate about what that means, but what a lot of people would suggest is that it's as time reaches towards its end, people's understanding of these passages will come into greater understanding. And so there is going to be greater understanding, but it's only for those who are humble enough to actually, let the text speak for itself rather than forcing their own worldview on the text. And just to be honest with you, that's where I do struggle, because we come from like a kind of Baptist background where we go to a Baptist church. My seminary was not Baptist; it was just theological and non-denominational, but it still has very Baptist roots to it. And a lot of the things that they teach at the seminary, they influence Baptist churches and stuff. And so we have to realize that we are coming from a very specific worldview, right? We are American evangelicals with a very Western mindset and like more of a Baptist background. And that is inherently going to shape how we read the text. And I just want us to be aware of that. Because in certain places in Scripture, it's a lot easier to realize how, like you can read through Genesis and you realize, wow, this is really weird. And it kind of, you're not going to read, people still do this, but it's harder to read a Baptist worldview into Genesis in a way that biases you, because Genesis is pretty straightforward to where if you're just honestly reading the text, you're just going to be like, oh, okay, I need to change how I'm thinking here. Whereas whenever you're dealing with future prophecy stuff, there's just this tendency where people get weird and they adopt these very specific views. And if we're not careful, our understanding of the text will be influenced more by the theology we bring into the text than by the text itself. And so I'm just saying a lot of this mainly because I could have said this any week that we were going through this, but since we only have 13 verses to cover through today, I figured just worth clarifying again. We always want our theology to be shaped by the text. We don't want our theology to shape how we read the text. If that makes sense. Yeah. Unless it is being shaped by theology we know for a fact comes from prior Scripture, right? And so that is kind of like the tricky thing there. So we need to let prior Scriptures inform us, but we don't want to bring outside worldviews into the text. And so that leads us to chapter 12. There are only going to be 2 slides here. And so, Sean, I'm just going to have you read through all of it real quick, just so that we have a big understanding of it. And after you read through it, we'll recap the general context, and then we'll head in. Sound good?
Sounds good.
Go for it.
Now at that time, Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people, will stand. And there will be a time of distress such as never happened since there was a nation until that time. And at that time your people, everyone who is found written in the book, will be rescued. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but the others to reproach and everlasting contempt. And those who have insight will shine brightly like the brightness of the expanse of heaven, and those who lead the many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But as for you, Daniel, conceal these words and seal up the book until the time of the end. Many will go to and fro, and knowledge will increase. Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, 2 others were standing, one on this bank of the river, and the other on that bank of the river. And one said to the man dressed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, how long will it be until the end of these wonders? And I heard the man dressed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, as he raised his right hand and his left toward heaven, and swore by him who lives forever that it would be for a time, times and half a time. And as soon as they complete shattering the power of the holy people, all these events will be completed. As for me, I heard but could not understand. So I said, my Lord, what will be the outcome of these events? Then he said, "Go your way, Daniel, for these words are concealed and sealed up until the time of the end. Many will be purged, purified, and refined, but the wicked will act wickedly, and none of the wicked will understand, but those who have insight will understand. But from the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. How blessed is he who keeps waiting and reaches the 1335 days. But as for you, go your way to the end. Then you will enter into rest and stand again for your allotted portion at the end of the days."
All right. And there ends the book of Daniel. And if we were not going to explain it, we could wrap up Bible study now. But that's not what we're going to do. We're going to study it. And so, right off the bat, in verse 1, you can tell that this chapter does not exist in isolation. Right? It starts off by saying, "Now at that time." And whenever you read "now at that time," what are you supposed to ask?
Well, what time is that time?
What time is that time? And how do you figure out the answer to that?
Context.
By reading the last chapter.
Yeah, you have to go to the last chapter, right? But then, if you go to the last chapter in Daniel, and you read verse 1 of chapter 11, it says, "Now I, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I stood to strengthen and to be a fortress for him." And you have to ask, well, who is I there? Well, then you have to go to chapter 10, right? And so chapter 10 is really where this whole thing gets going. And like I said, in many ways, chapter 10 and 12 are the bread of the sandwich, and chapter 11 is the meat, right? To where chapter 11 is really the, it is the, what was that noise? Oh, was that the microwave? Okay. Chapter 11 is the, that is the vision itself that Daniel has. Whereas chapter 10 and 12 are just the bookends. To where chapter 10 and 12, those are both involving Daniel on the edge of a river, interacting with these messengers who are explaining things to him, right? And so, can I get somebody to just recap what we saw in chapter 10? Then I'll have somebody else do chapter 11. But what happened in chapter 10?
So, chapter 10 begins. Daniel warns, he prays for a vision, and then essentially Michael shows up, freaks Daniel out, and then...
We're assuming it's Michael. We don't know.
Okay.
There's a man who shows up,
Man
and
who
Michael's
shows up.
mentioned later on, but we don't know for sure that there's the
Okay,
same
there's a
person.
man who shows up, freaks Daniel out, and then an angel who was apparently fighting the Prince of Persia, or this other spiritual figure comes and delivers Daniel a message.
Yeah, so I've kind of said this several times throughout these weeks. Chapters 10 through 12 are just weird. They are a vision unlike anything else we have in Scripture. They're going to be kind of similar to stuff we see in Ezekiel. But basically, Daniel, he's mourning for 3 weeks. We don't know what exactly he was mourning over. It doesn't tell us. But when we went through chapter 10, we kind of gave our thoughts and guesses there. But he's mourning for 3 weeks, and all of a sudden, while he's at the edge of this river, he has this stunning vision of this terrifying man. And the language is very similar to what we see in Revelation 1 describing Jesus. I'm not saying it is Jesus, I'm just saying it's similar language, which could kind of, that should help us understand a little bit more about what's going on in Revelation than really here, obviously. But Daniel has this crazy vision. He falls on his face, and he's terrified. And all of a sudden, a hand reaches out and lifts him up, and a voice begins to talk to him. But it doesn't specify who's talking to him here. But then later on, Daniel gets up, he turns around, this voice continues talking to him, and it says that this man is clothed in linen. And the man clothed in linen is going to show up again in this passage right here. And so the man clothed in linen seems to be the person who is talking to Daniel throughout this entire thing. But what we talked about back in chapter 10 is the man in linen the same person that Daniel, like the terrifying person that Daniel saw at the beginning of the vision? And to me, the answer would seem to be no. It seems like Daniel saw this guy, and then that guy seemingly just kind of disappeared. And then now you've got the man in linen talking to Daniel. And the man in linen is the one who talks to Daniel at the end of chapter 10. He's the one who gives Daniel the explanation throughout all chapter 11 about the kings of the north and kings of the south, which we'll turn to in a second. And then he continues talking in chapter 12, right? So really, the man in linen is the one who is doing all the talking here. And like Joseph pointed out, he communicates that he was sent to Daniel the moment Daniel started mourning 3 weeks earlier. But for some reason, he got held up, and that's because there was this Prince of Persia figure who apparently did not want Daniel to receive this message.
And
Because at the time, Persia is the one in charge. Yes.
And, at the reason we believe the Prince of Persia did not want Daniel to receive the message because it was a prophecy about Persia being destroyed.
That would seem to be part of it.
Yes.
But again, like there's so many things that we just don't know, and I think that's actually a good thing, right? Because we just have to remember that the Bible is not seeking to answer every single curiosity that we have. The Bible is telling us what we need to know, and so to me, the fact that it doesn't explain all the stuff about Michael and the Prince of Persia stuff, that actually lends credibility towards this being historically true, right? Whereas if Daniel were to have this vision and all of a sudden this person's like, hey, by the way, I was opposed by the Prince of Persia, and let me explain to you exactly who that is. Like, if he did that, it would almost sound like a made-up story. Whereas instead, you got this guy who just shows up, he says, Daniel, I started coming to you 3 weeks ago, I was held up by the Prince of Persia, and I was fighting him, Michael showed up, he helped me out, I got through, I'm here now. And he says, I gotta go in a second to go fight again, but before I go, I've got to tell you a vision, right? So it's really like there's a lot of high stakes where we didn't really talk about this in chapter 11, but you kind of get the idea that this guy is just like getting this vision out to Daniel really quickly because he's got to get back to the fight. And again, to me, that suggests that it's more historical because it doesn't look like Daniel is just trying to give us this very clear systematic theology of the unseen realm, whereas there is a temptation. This is where I was talking about the whole modern evangelical Western mindset thing. We love systematizing things. And so, like, even whenever I was in seminary, I had to take a class that was called Angelology. Then it was all about, like, an exhaustive study of angels. And it honestly drove me nuts because there were so many things in that class where people were just reading into the text as if the text was telling us everything there was to know. And they're like, well, there's this many types of angels, and these are the, like, there's all these classifications where I'm like, well, that's not what the text is saying. You're simply telling us what the text has revealed. But that's like suggesting, like, if you read a book that only featured male characters, you're all of a sudden concluding, oh, well, I guess that on that earth there were no females didn't exist. Well, that's not necessarily the case, right? There's all this other stuff that could be going on in the unseen realm that we just don't know about, and that's what the Bible would seem to suggest. To where it does not tell us who the Prince of Persia is. It does not tell us who Michael is, right? This is the first time Michael shows up, and it just says, by the way, this Michael dude, he helped us out. So you get the impression he's pretty cool, and he's going to show up again here in chapter 12, but he doesn't show up anywhere else in the Old Testament. He shows up in the New Testament, and he's called an archangel, but this is the only time he ever shows up in the Old Testament. And so I just think it's kind of cool how this stuff just happens, and you get the idea that there is this entire other world going on. It's kind of like whenever you're reading like Lord of the Rings or something like that, and a character shows up, and they don't. I think this is just like good storytelling in general. Let me contrast this real quick, just to give an example. The Lord of the Rings. Whenever you're reading it, there's this one scene whenever. Like Aragorn is like Aragorn, he's like the king who's going returning to eventually reign, and he starts singing this song, and as he is singing this song, it's detailing this story of this couple that was ripped apart from one another, but like who were destined to be together and stuff like that. And he sings this song, but he doesn't explain it too in depth. But then it turns out that Tolkien had this like super fleshed out story that he didn't just put into Lord of the Rings because he wanted the world to feel real. Right? And so, in general, whenever you start quoting stuff, you don't just start detailing the history of things, right? Like, if I were to start singing Michael Jackson's Billie Jean on just a random Tuesday, you wouldn't expect me to all of a sudden turn to everybody and say, now let me explain to you what the meaning of this song is. Billie Jean is this woman who was like, no, I'm just singing the song, right? Yeah. By contrast, on the most recent season of The Chosen, there's this one scene whenever a group of people are walking into Jerusalem. And these are Jewish people who have lived in the land their entire lives. And as they're walking into the city, they're talking about Passover, and they're like, what is the purpose of Passover? oh, well, why do we offer these sacrifices? Where do we get the sacrifices? How much do they charge? And it took me out of the scene. Because I was like, okay, guys, like, these people have lived there their entire lives. It is very clear that you are explaining this to the audience because this is a fictional story. Like you know what I mean? Like, it takes you out of it. And so I say all that just to point out that the fact that Daniel doesn't flesh out all that stuff would suggest to us that he isn't just trying to pique our curiosity. He's simply just telling us what his actual experience was.
Yeah.
This guy showed up, Prince of Persia, Michael, I made it here, I've got a message for you. To where that other stuff was just like side details. And he's like, what you need to know is chapter 11. And so, you get to chapter 11, and what do we see there?
Well, to your point, that's almost it's like the whenever people are going through and they're teaching how to be a good storyteller or how to be a good author, the one thing they always say is show, don't tell.
Mm-hmm.
Which is like, you don't want to over-explain your concepts to people, just show it through, the details of your world.
Yeah, and tell them the minimum they need to know
Yeah.
to get the story across. Yeah.
Anyway, chapter 11 is very tell and, not showing because the things that we're being told, we simply can't grasp our minds around.
Well, and it would also take 400 years to actually show it. So
Yeah. I wasn't really here for like the whole drawing the comparisons between the story of the kings to like the real world events, but I just find chapter 11 so fascinating because of like there's up until this point there hasn't really been a prophecy like this to where it's so detailed over such a stretch of time. We will often get glimpses into the future, but it's never really expanded as far as like this.
yeah,
is.
usually it's very general. It's
Yes.
like a shoot will come from the stump of Jesse. And you're like, okay, cool.
It gives you something to look forward to, and in this case, I don't really think Daniel is looking forward to this
Yeah.
because most of these events sound like they're going to be bad.
Well, yeah, because in general, the chapter it details, and you're just talking like the application of it. It details the fall of the Persian kingdom, the rise of the Greek kingdom, and the political unrest that the Greek kingdom is going to experience, and Jerusalem and Israel are smack dab in the middle of the conflict. Right? Like that's why, if you're wondering why it goes into so much detail about the king of the north and the king of the south, we talked about this last week, but it's talking about the Seleucid kingdom in the north and the Ptolemaic kingdom in the south, and the Seleucid kingdom is primarily in charge of like Babylon and Mesopotamia and everything, and like Turkey, and the Ptolemies are in charge of Egypt, and they're constantly at war with one another. And guess how those two lands are connected? Thank you.
Greece.
Yeah, they're connected by the land of Israel. And so Israel is smack dab in the middle of this conflict. And so, like you pointed out, Daniel's not looking forward to this at all. Because, keep in mind that all of this started off really back in chapter 9, where Daniel was sitting there studying the book of Jeremiah, and he realized, whoa, the 70 years are almost up. We're about to go back to the land. And God's like, okay, the 70 years were really in regards to Babylonian power. Babylon's going to fall, but after Babylon falls, Persia's going to rise. And after Persia falls, Greece is going to rise. And after Greece falls, Rome is going to rise.
Yeah.
And that's where in chapter 9 he gave like the vision of like the 70 weeks to where he's like, yeah, there's actually 490 years left when it comes to the judgment of the people, right? So after the instruction to go rebuild the city and its walls and everything, there's going to be another 490 years till the Messiah even shows up. And that ties back into the earlier visions of Daniel in regards to, the Son of Man who comes to establish his throne and everything. And so Daniel's not looking forward to any of this because he's basically realizing, turns out that the Messianic kingdom is not going to be established overnight. My people are going to suffer for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and then eventually the Messiah is going to show up. But even in Daniel chapter 9, God communicated that the Messiah was going to be cut off. And the idea is like he's going to be killed. And then, after an unspecified amount of time, there's going to be this final prince figure who shows up, does all this deplorable stuff, and then eventually the Messiah is going to show up and take him out, and then at the end, everything's going to be resolved. And so Daniel realizes, oh, this looks terrible. Which raises the question, why was chapter 11 necessary? Did God give chapter 11 just to discourage Daniel and to make him think that things were hopeless?
No, I think more so it's like a show of God's plan for the world at large.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, I do have plans for you, for my people. They're not necessarily going to be good always. You know, there's going to be a lot of tribulation, but also, you guys kind of brought this upon yourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't complain. Now I will show you so that they have like a good reference point,
Yeah.
basically in the future.
Well, yeah, because he did communicate from the beginning. It's 490 years to bring about the end of the transgression,
Mhm.
right? So they're really being punished for their idolatry and their sin, and even when they come back to the land, they're not going to learn their lesson. And so,
It'd be like if a criminal was being convicted of their crimes in court, and the judge all of a sudden decided to just not tell them their sentence. Like, it wouldn't make sense for God to not give the Jewish people the full details of how their transgression is going to be repaid.
yeah.
So,
And then, follow-up question. If God did not give Daniel this vision in chapter 11, what might the Jewish people be tempted to think whenever they are going through all of this stuff? Whenever there's so much unrest and stuff.
God forgot about them.
Yeah,
Or he broke his promise.
yeah, they might think that God has forgotten about them and that basically everything failed. Because keep in mind, God made a promise to David that there was going to be an eternal covenant, and he would always have a son sitting on the throne.
yeah,
But during these 400 years, there's not going to be a Davidic kingdom.
there's
And
not going to be
even
a kingdom at all.
Exactly, there's not going to be a kingdom at all. And keep in mind, in the previous visions, whenever Daniel saw these, whenever Nebuchadnezzar saw the vision of the statue, it was all one unified structure, right? And then Daniel in chapter 7 had the vision of the four beasts, and the empires seem to be unified. Whereas if you don't have chapter 11, once the Jewish people get to the Greek kingdom and there's so much unrest, there might be a temptation to think this doesn't seem unified, and it might seem like God failed, right? Like God was incorrect. Like he talked about how there was going to be this Greek empire, and everybody's just warring over one another. And so God gives this chapter to clarify, let me give you a feet on the ground look of what it's practically going to look like to live in this time period. And while it is the Greek Empire, and it really is that beast figure, if you're living in the land of Israel at the time, it's going to look like there's nobody in power. And they're constantly at war with one another, and Jerusalem's getting caught in the middle of it. And God's letting them know this is all part of the plan. And so if they didn't have chapter 11, they might think, God messed up, he forgot us, there's never going to be a king on the throne, all of his promises were wrong. And so chapter 11 really gives them that courage, because he gives, in the time when they would need it most, he gives them the most detailed prophecy. So rather than their faith being discouraged, or rather than losing faith, it should bolster their faith and make them realize, oh, what he said came to pass. Right? It's kind of like the difference between, if I were to turn to Sean and say, in the future, you will have hardship. That's one thing. But if I were to tell you, because keep in mind, people hear that all the time, right? People go to church and they hear, you're going to have trouble in life all the time. Yet whenever that trouble actually arises, there's still a lot of people who leave the faith because they weren't prepared for it, right? And yes, they heard it, but they didn't really believe it. However, what if one Sunday I stood at the pulpit and I turned to Sean and I started accurately predicting every hardship he would face for the next 20 years? All of a sudden, does that make the hardship easier? No. But rather than him losing faith in God, all of a sudden, as each one of those things accurately comes to pass, instead of him leaving God, it confirms to him that God actually did know what he was doing. You know what I mean? And so it does the opposite. And it's very similar to things that Jesus did, right? Whenever at the Last Supper, Jesus sits down with his apostles and he just tells them, let me tell you what's about to happen. Because if I don't tell you, you're going to, like, he says, even though I'm going to tell you, you're going to flee for a little bit. But I want to tell you this now so that when these things come to pass, you will believe. So you'll know it's all part of the plan. And so it seems like that's what God's doing in Daniel 11. So it's not that Daniel just wanted to like flex his prophetic muscles. It's that God knew that, keep in mind, during these 400 years, there are going to be no prophets, right? This is the intertestamental time period. There are not going to be any prophets showing up and telling the people, hey, God is still here for you. No, they have to rely on this. And so God gave them this one prophecy to really just hopefully encourage them. And all of that leads us, at long last, to chapter 12. The final verses of chapter 11, verses 36 through the end, we're talking about this king figure who is described in a manner very similar to Antiochus Epiphanes, right? That was the Antiochus Epiphanes was like the main bad guy in chapter 11, to where we got to see these competing figures from the north and the south, and then eventually there's this king of the north from the Seleucid kingdom who he is in charge of the land of Israel, and after he fails to conquer the south, he throws a temper tantrum going back through the land, and he basically just takes it out on the Jewish people, right? He bans sacrifices, he starts persecuting them, he starts putting them to death, he sets up an abomination of desolation in the temple, and then eventually there's going to be Jewish people who revolt against this, and we talked about this last week, how that basically is going to be the Maccabees who revolt, and that lays the groundwork for the festival of Hanukkah, which people celebrate to this day. And so Antiochus Epiphanes is like the main bad guy in chapter 11, but whenever you get to the final verses in chapter 11, there's this other bad guy who is described in a manner very similar to Antiochus Epiphanes, but not in the exact same way, to where if you actually look at Antiochus' life, it doesn't directly parallel the verses, like, or we don't have evidence of him doing all the things that Daniel said in those verses, right? And so it would suggest to us that there is some future guy, and whenever you look at the language there, it keeps talking about at the time of the end, at the time of the end, at the time of the end. And that leads us to chapter 12, verse 1. Now, at that time. So what time is it?
The end.
Seemingly the end, right? This is the time of that final guy that the guy was talking about in chapter 11. At that time, Michael the great prince, who stands guard over the sons of your people, will stand. All right.
So I want to. I had a thought during the recap of chapter 10
Okay.
that I wasn't really here for the chapter 10 discussion, so I don't know if y'all have already swung this theory out there, but what if the Prince of Persia that's like described in chapter 10 is the quote unquote son of God that was placed over the country of Persia to like.
That was our conclusion.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
Like kind of
Well,
like
I'm on the
Elohim,
same
if
page.
you will.
yes. Yeah. Yeah. What were you saying, Joe?
I said it was kind of like Elohim, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah, so basically like you go to Deuteronomy 32, whenever God appoints, like whenever he separates the nations, he portions them according to the numbers of the sons of God, right? So the Bnei Elohim. And so we kind of concluded that the Prince of Persia is he is the Elohim, the spiritual being that God has put over Persia. But that's where things do get really weird. And we did talk about this because whenever you get to chapters 10 and 12, who does it describe as being the prince of Israel, or of the Jewish people? Michael. Which is strange. Because again, if you go to Deuteronomy 32, what does it say, like, in that same verse? It says, whenever God split up the nations,
So God, or what, Israel will be my people?
he said, but Israel is Yahweh's portion. And so, consistently throughout Scripture, you have the teaching of, like, yes, God apportioned the nations, like he put these sons of God over the nations, but Yahweh is the one over Israel. But then you have this teaching in Daniel 10 and 12 where it says that Michael is the prince. And I talked about how, like, this has actually been making me very uncomfortable, mainly because there are people who believe that Michael is the same as Jesus. And most popularly, the people who believe that are Jehovah's Witnesses. And so it made me very nervous because I was like, oh my gosh, like, because as I've been reading it, I'm like, like, the text is almost forcing me to kind of think that, just because of if you're paying attention to the language. However, I did look into it, and there are good, genuine, God-fearing, like, legitimate, non-heretical, non-cult Bible teachers who have also concluded that Michael is Jesus. But there's a careful nuance, right? What Jehovah's Witness, and I'm not even saying that I believe that, but I'm saying that I'm more open to the idea now. But there's a careful nuance, right? What Jehovah's Witnesses suggest is they suggest that Michael is Jesus in the sense of Jesus is merely a created being, but he is the highest created being, right? So they would say that Jesus is merely an archangel. Whereas what these other people would believe is that Michael is simply another name for Jesus, the uncreated Son of God who is equal with the Father, right? And so that's where there's like it's a very important clarification, right? Because it's basically what your conclusion is if you say that Michael is Jesus, right? Are you saying that Jesus is lesser than we would typically promote as Christians? Because if you say that, that's where you stumble into heresy, because you are now denying the divinity of Jesus. However, if you're simply concluding that Michael is another name for Jesus, just in the same way that, you can call him the Christ, you can call him the living one, you can call him, like all the names that you see in the book of Genesis, right? You can call him by these other things, then that's okay, right? Because there would be evidence for that, because archangel, like Michael's called an archangel, he's the only person in the Bible called an archangel. And what does archangel mean? It just means the highest angel, right? The highest messenger. And we already believe as Christians that Jesus is the messenger of Yahweh that we see throughout the Old Testament. And so, again, I'm not saying I firmly believe Michael is Jesus, because I really just need to spend more time studying the scripture, and I don't want to claim that without clear evidence. But the stuff in Daniel here is really tripping me up. Especially because, once again, in Daniel chapter 10, you've got this figure who shows up to Daniel, and then he just apparently disappears. And all of a sudden in that same chapter, Michael is mentioned. But the way that man was described is in the same way that John describes Jesus in Revelation, whenever John has a very similar vision. Mm-hmm. And so that's where certain stuff like that is like, it started making me really nervous, because I'm like, I don't want to start a cult. But the language itself, it kind of is like, it's very curious, because it says, Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people. Right? So this is Michael, the prince over the Jewish people. And he is equivalent to the prince of Persia, who we saw in chapter 10. Mm-hmm. And you're like, that's a weird thing, just because we've never heard mention of Michael before. And then if you consider the word Michael just means the strength of God, right? And so it's like...
And then you can't put Jesus and the Prince of Persia on the same level if we're assuming Michael and this Prince of Persia are on the same level.
What do you mean?
I'm just saying you can't put Jesus and this Prince of Persia guy on the same level.
Well, you wouldn't be suggesting they're on the same level, because even in chapter 10, the guy who's talking to Daniel makes it clear that, like if anything, the guy talking to Daniel suggests that he is on level with the Prince of Persia. Because remember, the Prince of Persia, he couldn't get past the Prince of Persia. Michael showed up, all of a sudden it was no problem. Right? And so the idea is that Michael is way stronger than the Prince of Persia. Because all of a sudden when Michael shows up, the guy says, alright, once Michael showed up and helped me out, I was able to get through. And so you wouldn't necessarily be saying that. But they would be functioning in the same role. Right? And so the prince over the Jewish people is stronger than the prince over Persia. But again, this is where we might be getting distracted by like the side stuff, because the text itself isn't bothered with over-explaining everything. It simply says, hey, there's this Michael guy, and it doesn't tell us who Michael is. And so that's why we just need to be careful not to arrive at too firm of conclusions. But we do need to be willing to follow the text where it leads, is what I'm saying. So at that time, Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people, will stand. What is that communicating?
He's gonna like fight for them in the end.
Yeah.
Because that's kind of like, that's the language Daniel's been using throughout these chapters to reference like people fight. It's like they will stand.
Yeah. Well, and because it specifically said he's the one who stands guard over the sons, and he's going to stand. So what's he standing to do? To guard. And why would they need to be guarded, given what we saw in chapter 11?
Israel's basically gonna turn into like a huge battleground.
Yeah, people are going to be fighting over it all the time. And then there's going to be this guy who shows up, cuts off sacrifices, does all these terrible things, and is going to begin persecuting the people of God. And so he says, at that time, Michael's going to stand up and defend y'all. Which again, like lately I've been studying Revelation, and the language is so similar to where I'm like, it's driving me nuts a little bit to where I don't want to keep harping on the Michael and Jesus thing, but the way that he's being described here, it sounds like Michael is like this final person who saves the Jewish people.
it is definitely interesting
Yeah.
to like
Um,
go through with that.
Yeah, I do find it very fascinating, and like, I don't want to keep harping on it, but it's been something that I've been reflecting on a lot because I've also been in Revelation, like in my own study, and I'm like, wow, the way that Michael's being described here sounds like he's doing the stuff that John says Jesus is going to do. To where, when you get to Revelation, you've got Jesus, and he is the one standing on Mount Zion with the Jewish people, and he is the one who goes and wages war against the prince who is rising up against them and stuff, and he's the one who destroys them with the word of his mouth and stuff. So, I don't know. Anyways, he's standing guard over the sons of people. And there will be a time of distress such as never happened since there was a nation until that time. What do we see there?
Things are gonna get bad, like really bad.
Things get really bad. And this would also, again, lead us towards thinking this is a future event.
Yeah.
Because while the things under Antiochus Epiphanes were bad, they weren't worse than anything's ever been before. And you could argue that it's hyperbolic language, but if it's hyperbolic, you have to ask why they would describe it that way. It seems like this is supposed to be a genuinely horrible, horrible, horrible time. And this language is going to be picked up by Jesus in Matthew 24 and 25. Whenever the disciples turn to him and they say, what is going to be the sign of your coming and like the sign of your kingdom? And he's going to say, well, there's going to be stuff like this happening. But even then he tells them, there's going to be wars and all this stuff, but don't worry, that is not the sign of the time. The thing that Jesus associates with his return is the establishment of the abomination of desolation, which is also going to show up in chapter 12 here. So, so such has never happened since there was a nation until that time. And at that time, there's that phrase again. So what time is this?
The end.
Seemingly the end. And at that time, your people, everyone who is found written in the book, will be rescued. Can you hear me? My phone?
Sounds like Revelation language.
It does sound like Revelation language, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Do
so
we want to go to the actual?
you can if you want to.
Okay.
If you gotta.
We have the time, so let me just go and find.
We say that it's already 8 o'clock and we're only one verse in. It's gonna be the longest chapter.
It's a long verse, to be
Yeah,
fair.
it's fine.
1 hour on one verse.
We started like 20 minutes late though. But
Fair enough.
40 minutes on one verse.
Okay. Okay. Still though. Still.
Yeah. What verse were you
Well,
thinking?
you'd probably know this more than I would,
What verse are you looking for?
since you've looked in verses. The one about the people in the book of life.
Oh! Yeah, I don't know what verse it is, but yeah, the language of like there being a book of life and everybody's name being found in it, that is stuff that's picked up in Revelation. To where it talks about like the Lamb's book of life.
Mm-hmm.
Revelation 21:27 is what you're looking for. You want to flip to it and read it to us real quick?
Yeah. Do you want me to read a little bit further? Or?
Sure, go for it.
Alright, let's see. I can pick it back up. So, I'll just give a little bit of context for anyone who's wondering. In Revelation when this verse comes up, it's detailing the new Jerusalem and basically how it's going to look and how it's going to function. And in verse 27 it says, "And nothing defiled, and no one who practices abomination and lying shall ever come into it, but only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life." So basically it's detailing that, like, I guess in a sense this, is like a win for the Calvinists, to where it's like this could definitely be misconstrued as like predetermination, to where it's like certain people have their names already written in the book. But
Well, I would say
now that I'm not going to go down that path.
I would just say their names are in the book because they place their faith in God.
Yes.
Yeah.
But like it definitely, there's a lot of similarities to what Daniel is saying here, to where it's like God knows pretty much who's going to like place their faith in him.
And one thing that's worth clarifying just in this verse is that there is a distinct, like, the person talking to Daniel is distinguishing between the Jewish people, right? He says, at that time, your people, everyone who is found written in the book will be rescued. Which implies that there are going to be people in the book whose name, like, there are going to be people of Daniel's people whose names are not in the book, right? So there will be Jewish people whose names aren't found in the book, and that means they're not going to be rescued.
Mm-hmm.
Which means that, like, if you're a Jewish person reading this, you have to realize, apparently being a Jew is not enough. There has to be something else that gets you in the book, right? So the question becomes, what is it that gets you in the book? And I would refer us back to Daniel chapter 7, right? Well, who's going to be the one in charge of the kingdom? The Son of Man. And so you have to give your devotion to the king if you want to be part of his kingdom. And so I think that's where this all kind of ties together. But so they're going to be rescued, but not all of them, right? So just keep that in mind also whenever we say that we do believe that there is a future hope for the Jewish people. That is not to suggest that every single Jew who is alive whenever Jesus returns is going to believe in him. We simply believe that there's going to be a lot of them who come to him, right? If you're taking Revelation hyper literally, 144,000. I don't know if I think that could be more symbolic there, but there are some people who treat it very literally. But so there is a distinguishing mark here, and I think that it's just important to recognize that. So it's not just being Jewish that saves you, or it's not just being Jewish that allows you to be rescued from this distress. It's specifically having your name in the book of life. And so the question becomes, how do you get your name there? And many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake. These to everlasting life, but the others to reproach and everlasting contempt. What the heck is going on there? And why should our minds be blown by this right now?
One theory I've heard is that whenever we die, we're kind of put in a temporary rest, right? And then some people, I have one friend who argues that we will all awake for the tribulation to be tested once more, and then those who remain faithful will be in the book of life and will rise.
That is a hyper-specific theory. I was more just talking generally.
I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. Like, what is being described in this verse?
Is this the first time that's really been mentioned, something about like eternal?
Yes, that's what I was going for. Explain that.
Just the Old Testament in general doesn't touch a lot on like afterlife or anything. I mean, the few times it does are even arguable in itself.
Mm-hmm.
This is probably the first time I could think of where there's really a statement about like an eternal condition, eternal state.
Yeah, this is pretty much this is the most explicit reference to a future resurrection in the entire Old Testament, and this is something that we take for granted. And this is why, again, at the beginning, I clarified we need to get out of our modern American Christian mindsets, because especially as us Baptists, we make everything about eternity, right? To where the reason why discipleship is lacking so much in the modern church is because we don't talk to people about why they need to live for God now. We simply talk to them about why they need to bow their head, pray a prayer so they can go to heaven when they die, right? So we've turned everything into just focus on eternity. And that's why you always have that joke about like people being so eternally minded that they're no earthly good. And that's what we see in the church. to where we've made everything about the future. And to be clear, the New Testament does say that our hope should be in the future resurrection. But the whole reason we place our hope in the future resurrection is because that allows us to live faithfully now. That's why, like, and one thing I would say that this verse 2 right here is just explicitly detailing what was implicit throughout the rest of the book of Daniel. Because keep in mind, throughout the rest of the book, what have Daniel and his friends been willing to do?
Die.
They've been willing to die for their faith. And that's a really hard thing to explain if you're just like why is your faith worth dying for unless there is like some sort of resolution at the end of this? I mean, I guess you could say they were just noble figures who, you know, because God is worthy, they were going to lay down their life. That's possible. But the thing is, the fact that they were so willing to do it is because they are confident that there is this future state, right? But the Old Testament in general just doesn't focus on that much, right? The Torah is very focused on here's how you serve God now. And then the rest of the Old Testament is focusing on how the Jewish people failed to do that. And so really the Hebrew scriptures just don't focus a lot on the afterlife, right? You've got a few references to Sheol, but that's just like a general term for like the grave, and it's never like fleshed out. Whereas right here in this verse, the person explicitly says to Daniel, many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground, so that's dead people, right? So dead people will awake, right? So the idea is that they will come back to life, right? They're not turning into zombies, they're coming back to life. And we're going to see this language also in Ezekiel, right? So you see how Daniel and Ezekiel are, they're really born at the same time period, right? Because Ezekiel's going to have this vision of dry bones coming to life. And so many who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life. So who is it who's going to go to everlasting life?
Those who worship God.
Those whose names are in the book of life, right? Those ones are going to go to everlasting life, but the others to reproach and everlasting contempt. And so what is the fate of the people whose names aren't in the book of life?
Eternal suffering.
Eternal suffering, right? And so here we have, this is where we have the doctrine of heaven and hell. And so there's going to be an eternal reward or an eternal punishment. And this is the clearest verse that states this in the Old Testament. And it should blow our minds because it's like, I don't know, the rest of the Old Testament is focused on like, 70 or so years you have on earth. And then all of a sudden, with this one verse, the floodgates of eternity open up. And you're like, whoa, what? Like, it just radically transforms your whole worldview of things. But you get the idea that both are going to be raised to life, right? And so it's not that the people down in hell are just living some disembodied experience. No, they are in bodies, but they're physically suffering. And the Bible doesn't really explain what that looks like, and it really doesn't explain what eternal life looks like for us that much either. It just tells us that that's what the two options are, right? There's going to be reward or punishment, and then there's a lot of metaphors used to explain what that kind of looks like, but we don't really get it fleshed out because we really don't need to know. But then again, people have this whole thing where they have like books written about like what heaven will be like.
Lake of fire.
Yeah. And keep in mind that some of those going to everlasting contempt will be amongst the Jewish people, right? Because it specified the ones who are going to everlasting life are the ones whose names are in the book of life. And he clarified in verse 1 that some of those people are going to be Jewish people, right? So some are in the book of life, some aren't. And so the whole thing is being in the book of life, not simply being Jewish. I just want to highlight that because that's going to be something that pops up later on when we're in the New Testament. And Jesus and John the Baptist are getting onto the Jewish people saying, why don't y'all get this? Because it's very clear in the Old Testament that being Jewish is not enough. But the Jewish people are going to miss that. And I think that we kind of do the same thing, right? To where we all like to think that we're part of the in-group. Whenever Jesus says, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, and they won't enter the kingdom of heaven. We always like to think that that's other people. We never like to think, wait, am I one of those people who is saying, Lord, Lord, who's not going to enter the kingdom? And so we really have to examine ourselves and make sure that we are in the book of life and stuff. And those who have insight will shine brightly like the brightness of the expanse of heaven, and those who lead the many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. All right, so what do we see there?
Is it talking about prophets?
The language is strange. Could be a prophet. So we did see the language of people having insight in the previous chapter, and what do we interpret that as? This was like during the time of the Maccabees and stuff like that. During
Yeah.
Antiochus Epiphanes.
Yeah, it seems like for Paul, we talked about that as being like more the people who were like basically martyrs. Like people who were willing to see like we kind of contrast them a little bit with the people who actually fought back and how like there was almost like the greater response was to submit and to like unto death because those people like they were able to kind of see ahead and they had a bit greater insight into like what God was wanting of them.
Yeah. So it wasn't. They're not so focused on putting their hope in the present that they fight back and establish the kingdom themselves. Instead, they're willing to wait for God's timing and suffer even unto death because they understand how God's whole thing works. And in this case, you have this promise, like in the previous verse, that those who lay in the dust of the ground are going to awake. And keep in mind how that even calls way back to the Garden of Eden, right? To where God had said, because of Adam's sin, he was going to return to the dust. But now you have the idea that even those in the dust will come awake. And so God is reversing Eden right here and bringing us back to it. And also keep in mind that Adam himself was made from the dust. And so this language of people in the dust awaking, it's like they're being made into new Adams. And they're being restored to an Eden-like state. And so those who have insight, it seems like this is just talking about some sort of religious leader or somebody who, they understand the path, right? They are, like, during this time period, they are willing to suffer, they are willing to die, and they are guiding others into the book of life, right? And so, from a New Testament mindset, I would associate this with, like, the apostles. But then also just, in general, probably just religious leaders who are, they're faithful shepherds of God, if that makes sense. And what does he compare them to?
The stars.
The stars. In Revelation, whenever John sees this vision of Jesus, he has 7 stars in his right hand. And what does Jesus say the 7 stars represent?
I believe it was 7 churches.
So he's surrounded by 7 lampstands, and those represent the churches. But he says the 7 stars
The
represent.
number 7 is brought up a lot in Revelation.
It is. Yeah. It's almost like God is making a new creation, and so 7, 7, 7. But in Jesus' hand, there's 7 stars, and he says those are the 7 messengers of the 7 churches. And people debate about this, and they'll say, oh, well, this is talking about angels who preside over the churches. And that is one possible theory. I would lean towards this being like human messengers. Like, it's either the pastors of the churches themselves or the literal people who deliver the message. Like, because keep in mind, in the next chapters, Jesus gives messages to the churches, and it says, to the messenger of this church, write this. And so it seems to me that these are probably human messengers who deliver this. But you have the idea that there's these human religious leaders who are compared to the stars of heaven. Which is interesting because throughout the rest of the Old Testament, angels are typically compared to the heavenly host, right? The stars of heaven. But now you have humans who are seemingly being elevated above the angels. Which is also something that we see in the Old Testament, right? And then the New Testament expands on that, like in Hebrews and stuff. But, yeah, so those who have insight will shine brightly like the brightness of the expanse of heaven, and those who lead the many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. And so these people are going to have a special reward because they are the ones who are leading people into the book of life and leading them into righteousness. Which is also interesting because keep in mind, the primary audience that the guy's talking about here is the Jewish people. And so there are Jewish people who are not in the way of righteousness. But then there are going to be people who lead them into it. And so, as Christians, we would kind of associate this with the apostolic church, right? The ones who lead them into the way. And then sure enough, you have Jesus telling the apostles that they will sit on 12 thrones in the kingdom and that they are going to judge over the nations and stuff. And so this would kind of all tie into that. But as for you, Daniel, and so I kind of get like the idea that Daniel's probably getting so like distracted by all this like amazing stuff he's learning. And then the angel says, but here's your job. Right? As for you, Daniel, conceal these words and seal up the book until the time of the end. Many will go to and fro, and knowledge will increase. So what does he say to Daniel?
Basically to just like, seal up the words that he's told him and like don't bring them out until the time that's supposed to come. Which, a heck of a job he did of that.
Yeah.
And we're reading it now, so.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's been stored up. And I can't help but think that this is tied also to Revelation. Because keep in mind, whenever you hear seal up a book at this time period, whenever they say book, what do they have in mind?
Like a scroll.
They're thinking a scroll, right? Whenever we think book, we think this is called a codex, right? Because there's a difference between, like, a codex is whenever you put all the pages side by side and you bind them on the end because it's easier to flip. But that wasn't really a big development until the intertestamental time period. Whereas before that, it was primarily scrolls, right? So whenever it says seal up the book, he's saying seal up the scroll until the time of the end. How does Revelation open up? It opens up with a lamb, and he's breaking open the scrolls, like the seals on the scroll. And then at the end of Revelation, there are all these names found in the Lamb's Book of Life, right? And so there seems to be like this connection there. And so it seems to me that this verse is really the angel saying to Daniel, your job's done, right? Like, because keep in mind, at this point, Daniel's an old man, right? He has lived in Babylon for the full 70 years. And so he's probably easily in his like mid-80s at this point, which is pretty old at that time period, right? We're not in the book of Genesis when people are living to like the 900s. At this time period, people like, if you lived to 60, you're doing a pretty good job. And so he's in his like mid-80s right now. He's an old man. He's living in the Persian time period now, and his life is coming to an end. And so the guy says to Daniel, as for you, Daniel, conceal these words and seal up the book, right? So your book is over. Your job is done. Wrap it up, seal it up, and preserve this until the time of the end. Because many will go to and fro, and knowledge will increase. So what is that? What's being communicated there?
He's saying your time's done, seal it up, store it away, keep it safe.
Yeah,
And
what's
then-
going on with the last?
And then as time passes on, these events will transpire, and people will start to have more faith because these events were predicted, and they're like, oh, so this is what Scripture was saying about this future event, and so on and so forth.
What's going on with like the many will go to and fro thing though?
Many will come and go. Many will live and die.
Is that what y'all think? I don't know. That phrase to me is kind of weird. But
Yeah, that
It's either-
seems to be the most likely. It's basically Michael telling him, like, well, while your job is done, it's like there's still a lot of time that has to pass for these events to occur. So, many people are going to live, many people are going to die, but, your words will have a lasting impact.
yeah.
Another interpretation could just simply mean be coming and going, but I tend to think it's more like life, like living and dying, to personify the passage of time.
I'd agree with that. It's like, Daniel, your job is done now. Seal up the book. People are going to live, they're going to die, time's going to pass. And as time passes, people will come to understand what you've written. Because Daniel right now, he has no idea what's going on. Because for us, we're living 2,000 years later. We're living like 2,500 years later. And so we have a much better understanding because I can be like, oh yes, this is referring to the Seleucids and the Maccabees and the Ptolemies and Antiochus Epiphanes. And I can even look at some of this and say, oh yeah, this sounds a lot like Revelation. But that's because we're living so longer afterwards, right? We have thousands of years of history to look back upon to help us interpret this. We have 27 more books in the New Testament to help us understand it. Whereas Daniel's just here and he's just receiving all of it, and it's like drinking from the biggest fire hydrant that you've like ever seen. He's just like taking it all in. He does not get it. But he says, Daniel, your job is not to understand it. Your job is to simply write it down. Seal it in a book. As time passes, people will come to understand it, right? Your job is not to get everything. Your job is to pass things along to the future generations. And he is serving people who aren't even alive yet, which is kind of cool.
It's less so trying to drink from a fire hydrant and trying to drink from, like, a breach in the Hoover Dam. Where it's just like...
Or the Hoover Dam just fully breaks and you're trying to drink it as you're also being swallowed up in it. Okay, so there's that, which leads us into the final verses in the book of Daniel. So the guy finishes talking. Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, two others were standing, one on this bank of the river, and the other on that bank of the river.
Two guys standing, one on one side of the river and the other on the other side.
Yeah, and when it says two others, I'm assuming these are two other angels.
Angels, yes.
Is this the Euphrates?
What river was this? It's the I think it's the Tigris.
Yeah, is the Tigris.
Yeah. Yeah, because in chapter 10, on the 24th day of the first month, while I was standing on the bank, by the bank of the great river, that is the Tigris, I lifted my eyes and looked, and behold, there was a certain man dressed in linen, whose loins were girded with a belt of pure fine gold of Uphaz. And so as we go into the rest of this, whenever it says the man clothed in linen, we have to figure out, is this the same man that Daniel saw at first, or is this the man that Daniel was speaking to, who he also says was dressed in linen? And so, man, Elijah would have had a nice makeover. He went from dressing in camel's hair to fine linen. It's like, whoa. Okay, so he looks and he sees two others standing, one on this bank of the river and one on the other bank of the river. What's going on there?
They're just like standing across from each other, looking when each other.
Maybe, is there
Yeah.
some kind of, and again, I'm just speculating here, but is there some kind of symbolic reason as to like why they're on one side of the river and the other side of the river, and not just like standing next to each other?
Because they hate each other.
I don't fully know here. I've seen some people talk about how like rivers can represent like throughout Scripture, rivers represent borders all the times. The issue here is that the Tigris River is it's the northern river, so it's not like the Tigris is the one separating Daniel from Israel, right?
Yeah.
So I don't really know what the symbolism would be here. Like the fact that he feels the need to mention this, because there's going to be one standing on one side, one standing on the other, and then the other man is above the waters. And so there's three, one on each side, one above the waters. I don't know what the symbolism of that is. It's almost like the angels are forming like a bridge over the river. But I don't know why he'd be wanting to get to the other side of the Tigris River. So I don't know. Who knows? Maybe the next few verses will explain it to us and we can come back to it. But for now, he sees the two people standing, one on one side of the river, one on the other. And one said to the man dressed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, "How long will it be until the end of these wonders?" And so it's not even Daniel who speaks here. It is one of the angels who asks the man in linen for understanding. He says, "How long will it be until the end of these wonders?" And so what does he want to know?
When are the end times, essentially?
Yeah. How long will it be? Well, like, so you don't know, is he saying how long from the moment he's talking about until then? Or is it how long once this king is set up until the end? You know what I mean? Because it keeps saying at that time, at that time, at that time.
So I feel like if it keeps saying at that time, I'm assuming it's how long will from that time of the king till the end of the wonders last.
That's what I would assume, right? So if this time is the starting point, how long until the end from there? To the end of these wonders. "And I heard the man dressed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, as he raised his right hand and his left toward heaven, and he swore by him who lives forever, that it would be for a time, times, and half a time. And as soon as they complete, shattering the power of the holy people, all these events will be completed."
Okay, so when we say a time, times, and seven, okay, time, times, and half a time. So I would assume 770 or 700
Where are you coming up with 7?
for completion.
But where are you coming up with 7, like, in the passage?
Oh. I might jump the gun on that.
Is this part where some people get like the 3.5 years?
Yeah, well, especially because also later on it's going to say, like, 1,290 days and stuff. Yeah, so how'd you get 3.5 years?
Time, times, and half a time.
Yeah, so it doesn't specify what the length of time is, but the general consensus when you get later on, it would be 3.5 years, right? Because time is 1 year, times would be 2 more years, and then half a time would be do that with my finger. 3.5 years.
Oh,
right?
okay.
Yeah. And this ties into stuff we've seen in previous chapters, right? I believe it was in chapter 8, and then chapter 11, maybe, where we've seen the recurring idea of 3.5 years, 3.5 years, 3.5 years throughout this, and so it seems like these are all referencing the same event, which let me see, what was that? Where was the other time in Daniel? Let me see if I can find it real quick. Yeah, so in Daniel chapter 8, this is whenever he saw, the vision of the ram and the goat. The ram represented Persia, the goat represented Greece. And out of one of them, so this is out of Greece, came a small horn, and it grew exceedingly great toward the south, the east, toward the beautiful land. And then it magnified itself to be equal with the commander of the hosts, and it removed the regular sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was thrown down, so he destroys the temple. And on account of the transgression, the host will be given over to the horn along with the regular sacrifice, and it will be thrown, and it will throw truth down to the ground and do its will and succeed. And I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that particular one who was speaking, "How long will the vision about the regular sacrifice apply, while the transgression causes desolation, so as to allow both the holy place and the host to be trampled?" And so in chapter 8, we saw a very similar interaction where one angel says to the other, "How long will this be for?" And then the other one responds to Daniel and says, "For 2300 evenings and mornings, then the holy place will be made righteous." And so that would be either, depending on how you interpret that, either 7 years or 3.5 years, right? If you're interpreting it as 2300 evenings and 2300 mornings, that's 7 years. But if it's 2300 evenings and mornings together, then you cut it in half, and that'd be 3.5 years. But we saw that before. And so, same thing here, to where he says, for time, times, and half a time. So, 3.5 years. And as soon as a complete shattering, as soon as they complete shattering the power of the holy people, all these events will be completed. So, what is going to be the thing that finally brings the 3.5 years to a close?
The shattering of the holy people.
What does that mean?
Not anything good for the people who are holy.
It's like the Revelation verse about the blood of the martyrs coming to a fullness.
Yes, I've got several cross references here. And one of them is not in Revelation, but I bet y'all can guess where it's from. Deuteronomy 32.
Yeah.
I can't wait till Sean and I do that one chapter for our podcast, because we're literally going to cover one chapter, but that's going to be our longest episode ever. It's going to be like 6 hours long.
I hope you bring a bottle of water, buddy.
Yeah. So Deuteronomy 32. We're just going to do a 24-hour live stream. That's what we're going to do.
Break
Deuteronomy
down
32.
each word of the book.
What's that?
I said break down each word of the chapter.
Yes. So in Deuteronomy 32, remember, God says that he's going to do 3 main things to punish the Jewish people whenever they rebel. Right? One thing he's going to do is he's going to hide his face from them. Second thing he's going to do is he's going to take himself and give himself to the Gentiles. Third thing he's going to do, he's going to destroy them. And then you read this in verse 36. For Yahweh will render justice to his people, and he will have compassion on his slaves, when he sees that their strength is gone, and there is none remaining bond or free. And he will say, where are their gods, the rock in which they sought refuge? Who ate the fat of their sacrifices and drank the wine of their drink offering? Let them rise and help you. Let them be your hiding place. See now that I am he, and there is no God besides me. It is I who put to death and give life. I have wounded, it is I who heal. There is no one who can deliver from my hand. And then notice the imagery here. Indeed, I lift up my hand to heaven and say, as I live forever, if I sharpen my flashing sword and my hand takes hold on judgment, I will render vengeance on my adversaries, and I will repay those who hate me. I will make my arrows drunk with blood, and my sword will devour flesh, with the blood of the slain and the captives, for the long-haired leaders of the enemy. O nations, cause his people to shout for joy, for he will avenge the blood of his slaves, and he will render vengeance on his adversaries, and he will atone for his land and his people. And so what God says there is that he is going to wait until the last moment, And when their strength is almost gone and they have nothing left, in that moment he's going to show up and he's going to save them. And God seals this by lifting up his hand to heaven, and he swears in his own name, which I think is one of like the dopest moments in the entire Bible. Like literally just the image of God himself. Like often, like I mean nowadays even in courts, you know, you have people put their hand on the Bible and they swear in the name of God, whereas this is God himself, hand to heaven, swearing in his own name. He says, "As surely as I live forever, I will do this." But he says he's only going to save the Jewish people when they are brought to the end of their strength. And that's what Daniel says here. Fast forward a little bit, you do get to Revelation, and this is what Sean was referencing a little bit earlier, where you have Jesus opening the seals on the scroll, and whenever the fifth seal is opened, I believe, let me see if I can find it. And when he opened the fifth seal, I saw underneath the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God, and because of the witness which they take. And they cried out with a loud voice, saying, "How long, O Master, holy and true? Will you not judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth?" And a white robe was given to each of them, and it was told to them that they should rest a little while longer, until the number of their fellow slaves and their brothers who were to be killed, even as they had been, would be completed also. So the idea is that God is going to wait until the number of martyrs has been brought to its full. And so he's going to allow the people to be shattered and brought to their weakest point. The next chapter in Revelation, it says that God sets apart 144,000 Jews to be preserved during this time period. And that would seemingly be because the Jewish population isn't that huge. And if you interpret Revelation literally, and a third of the population is being wiped out all the time, the Jewish people would just be gone. And so God sets apart Jewish people so that they remain whenever when he returns. Which then leads to chapter 10 in Revelation, which also I think ties into this. Once again, pay attention to the imagery. Then I saw another strong angel coming down out of heaven, clothed with a cloud, and the rainbow was upon his head. And his voice was like the sun, and his feet like pillars of fire. And he had in his hand a little scroll which was open. He placed his right foot on the sea and his left on the earth, and he cried out with a loud voice, as when a lion roars. And when he had cried out, the seven peals of thunder uttered their voices. Then the angel, whom I saw standing on the sea and on the earth, lifted up his right hand to heaven, and he swore by him who lives forever and ever, who created heaven and the things in it, and the earth and the things in it, and the sea and the things in it, that there will be a delay no longer. But in the days of the voice of the seventh angel, when he is about to sound, then the mystery of God is finished, as he proclaimed good news to his slaves, the prophets. So in Revelation 10, you have an angel descending. He stands with 1 foot on the land, 1 foot on the sea. He raises up his hand to heaven, and he swears in the name of God. And he says the mystery of God will be accomplished, and there will be no more delay. The idea, whenever we read in the Bible about the mystery of God, what is that typically referring to? Whenever Paul talks about it, what is the mystery of God?
Like the resurrection?
Not typically the resurrection.
Like the mystery being like the inclusion of Gentiles?
It's usually talking about Gentiles being included in the fold of God. Like Gentiles being grafted onto Israel. And so the angel here, he says that there will be no more delay and that the mystery will be fulfilled. And so the idea is that the time of the Gentiles is coming to an end, and there will be no more delay. The kingdom is about to be established. And so I just want to highlight how both Deuteronomy and Revelation associate, like they have this imagery of a person standing, hand to heaven, swearing in the name of God. In Deuteronomy's case, it's God himself swearing by his own name. And he says he's going to let his people be brought to their end, and then he's going to save them last minute. In Revelation, you have an angel who is not identified, who he swears in God's name, and he says the time of the Gentiles has come, it's time to establish the kingdom. And in the previous chapters, it says there are Jewish people who are being preserved, so they're not wiped out, but meanwhile, a bunch of holy people are being martyred. Right? And so I'm just pointing out that all of this is painting a very similar image to what Daniel's saying right here. Mm-hmm. Right? So he hears the man dressed in linen above the waters, and he raised his right hand and his left toward heaven. So this guy, he's not lifting one hand, he's lifting both. Right? It's kind of a funny image. And he swore by him who lives forever and ever. So who is him who lives forever and ever?
God.
Yahweh, right? It's God. He swears by him that it would be for a time, times and half a time, 3.5 years. And as soon as they complete shattering the power of the holy people, all these events will be completed. Sure enough, when you read Revelation, the imagery of 3.5 years is going to show up again and again and again and again. Whenever people talk about the 7-year tribulation, the only place they get that from is Daniel chapter 9. There's nowhere else in the book in the Bible that would suggest a 7-year tribulation. It really hinges on how you interpret the 70th week of Daniel, which we talked about that in Daniel chapter 9, and it's very hard to interpret that. But in general, the rest of the Bible emphasizes 3.5 years, 3.5 years, 3.5 years. And I guess you also could have the 2,800 days from chapter 8 of Daniel as well.
2300.
This is what I meant, 2,300. Verse 8. As for me, this is Daniel talking. I love Daniel. I love that he just never knows what's happening. As for me, I heard but could not understand. And this does comfort me a little bit. It's kind of like when you're reading 2 Peter, and Peter says, a lot of Paul's teachings are really hard to understand. That encourages me, because Peter is like the leader of the apostles. And if he thinks that Paul's teachings are hard to understand, it makes me feel better when I'm confused by Paul. When you're reading Daniel, his reputation throughout the entire book is being like one of the smartest guys in the world. But then when it gets to not only is he smart, he has the insight of the gods. But you get to verse 8, and he's like, I could not understand this. And so
I don't know what the heck these guys are doing.
yeah. And so that encourages me, because it's like, okay, like Daniel himself is admitting that this is supposed to be difficult, right? There are other passages where, I don't know, like the book of Revelation, by definition, it is supposed to reveal things, and it's not supposed to be as difficult, right? It's supposed to simplify things, if anything. Whereas Daniel here, he's like, yeah, I don't know what's happening. And thankfully for him, like he's thinking, I'm glad it's not my job to explain it all. My job is simply to seal the book and give it to y'all. And so it does encourage me that he doesn't understand it, because that lets me know it's supposed to be challenging. And so, again, we need to have humility as we interpret this. So I heard, but I could not understand. So I said, my Lord, what will be the outcome of these events? So, what is Daniel curious about here?
It's like, what's going to happen after these events after all this happens?
Yeah. What's the end result? Because so far, what has been like the news that he's seen again and again and again?
It's just all doom and gloom, like
Israel's gone.
Israel's gone. Israel's going to be destroyed. There's going to be a lot of war, and Israel's going to be right in the middle of it.
Yeah. And the last thing he heard is that the way this comes to an end is with God's people being shattered.
People are being shattered.
Yeah. Yeah, so Daniel's like, God, or just angel, excuse me, sir, quick question. Is there good news? Like, it's like there's you've said a lot of stuff, and I have had previous visions of like an eternal kingdom and stuff, but like you haven't mentioned any of that. You've just mentioned our people being shattered, and what's the outcome? Verse 9, then he said, go your way, Daniel, for these words are concealed and sealed up until the time of the end.
So a very comforting answer.
Yeah, so what does he say?
I'm not gonna tell you.
Yeah.
He's like, you don't need to know that.
Yeah.
It's like you'll find out when Judgment Day comes.
Yeah.
Just give your better rest. You're overworking yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. Daniel's just like, so what's gonna happen here? And the guy's like, Nunya. Nunya what? Nunya business. Yeah. Daniel's like, I really would like to understand. But again, this ties back to what he had said earlier.
And he
He
said,
said-
don't be anxious. It's not your place to understand.
Well, and I think that there's probably some sort of application there as well. Like in regards to, I think there's like this temptation amongst us to where we want to be all like, I don't know.
We want to be all
The whole
like,
reason we're here is that we're trying to figure out what all this
Yes.
means. And like we're constantly chasing understanding to try to,
Well-
have in our own heads like
Well, there's also a bit of application here too, because it's like sometimes we ask God like why things happen the way they do on this earth, and we struggle to understand that. And here, it plainly says that Daniel asked and he didn't receive an answer, and we might have the same thing happen here, right?
Yeah, and I think that there is a temptation amongst people to think that we're entitled to an answer from God.
Exactly.
But oftentimes throughout Scripture, well, not oftentimes, but in certain instances when somebody is speaking directly to God or to an angel or something like that, and they ask for clarification, in a lot of those instances, I mean, there are some exceptions where the person will give further explanation, but in a lot of instances, the response is, it's not your business to know. And I think that is interesting because there's personal application, but it also gives us understanding of like what it means to be a prophet. There are a lot of things that we see in the prophets where we wonder like how much did they know? Like whenever he wrote down Isaiah 53, how much did he know? Right? Was he seeing Jesus on the cross, or was he simply given the words to write down? Right? And he just didn't understand. You know what I mean? Like whenever David wrote Psalm 22. Did he know that he was prophesying about the suffering of his great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson? Or was he simply writing a song? You know, and Daniel here, the angel told him, it's not your job to understand, it's simply your job to write it down and conceal the book. Right? Like, your job is to be the author, you don't have to explain everything. And I think that the application here, it does tie into one thing that I've kind of tried to talk about a lot as we've been going through the prophets, is that I think that the way that prophecy works in the Bible is that in many ways it is impossible to know what the prophecy means until after it is fulfilled. To where usually whenever people get stumped and they get messed up is whenever they arrive at a conclusion about a prophecy and then they end up being wrong. Right? We saw this like in Genesis. There's this very vague prophecy in Genesis 25 about Jacob and Esau, where we typically translate it as the older shall serve the younger. But our English translations are actually simplifying it a little bit, and they're reading the later story into the prophecy. Because we know that Jacob ends up being the one over Esau. But if you actually read it in Hebrew, it literally just says, the greater shall serve the lesser. But even then, the language, like, the way that it's formatted, the language itself does not specify who is the noun and who is the object. So it could read the greater shall serve the lesser, but it also could read the lesser shall serve the greater. And so it's very ambiguous, and it's only after the story's over that you know the answer. And so when you actually read the story, you've got Isaac and Rebekah who are at war with one another, trying to fulfill the prophecy how they see fit. To where Rebekah, her favorite son is the younger son, and so she wants to elevate him over Esau, and so she's wanting it to be the older shall serve the younger. Whereas Isaac, his favorite son, is Esau, the older one, and the greater one from a human perspective. And so he's trying to elevate Esau over Jacob, and he wants it to be the greater shall serve the lesser. Right? Or the lesser shall serve the greater, something like that. And then it's only after the fact where you actually get to see what God actually meant. And I think that's often the case with prophecy in like in Scripture, to where Isaiah says, the virgin shall give birth to a son. And if you read the next chapter in Isaiah, it looks like there's a fulfillment of it. But then, centuries and centuries and centuries later, a literal virgin gives birth to a son, who is literally God with us. And it's like, oh, that's what God meant. And so I think that there's this idea that prophecy cannot be understood until it's fulfilled. And the reason why the Jewish people killed their Messiah is because they thought they knew what the Messiah was going to look like because they interpreted the prophecy wrong. You know, and so I think that this is like a general call to humility to realize, you know what? Maybe like Daniel, it's not our job to understand, but the reason why God gave this is so that we could study it, so that if we were alive to see it fulfilled, then we would be like, okay, and it would inspire belief. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And another thing is that I don't think we should feel anxious in our lack of understanding. I think it should almost comfort us.
Yeah.
That, like, we believe in a God who, you know, knows all things that are and all things that will come to be. And so, while it's not our job to understand necessarily for our own selves, and as like a way of, you know, comforting us for the future, it's like we should still have faith in Him.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think that that's really the whole purpose of the prophecies, right? Because if God did not give the prophecies so that we would simply know what the future was, why did he give them? Well, he gave them to encourage us to trust him, right? So that when they come to pass, we're like, oh, I had no, like, he literally told me what was going to happen. I still didn't understand it, but he understood it way back then, you know? And so as prophecies are being fulfilled, it's supposed to encourage your faith. And so, again, this is where we have a, we benefit from living thousands of years after Daniel because we have seen how Daniel's prophecies came to pass. And so we have even more reason for trusting God than even Daniel did.
People have gone to and fro, knowledge has increased.
Yeah. And then, like, if you compare this to, like, Abraham, it's so amazing. Like, the fact that really all that he had to trust that God was faithful was the fact that his elderly wife gave birth to a son. That was it, right? And that's what makes Abraham's faith so successful because, like, he did not have any scripture. He did not have any other things. The only thing he had is that God said, your wife will give birth to a son. And then Isaac is born, and he's like, sweet. But prior to that, he had nothing, right? Prior to that, it was literally God just showing up and saying, hey, this is going to happen. And it didn't happen for 25 years. And so we benefit from the fact that we're living, we have 66 books in the Bible. In chapter 11 alone, we have 140 prophecies that have been fulfilled. And so that should really encourage us. And so the guy says, go your way, Daniel, for these words are concealed and sealed up until the time of the end. He says, sorry, Daniel, I already told you to close the book. If I had anything else to tell you, I would have already said it. So just scurry along, little Daniel. Your time as a prophet is done. But he does say this, many will be purged, purified, and refined, but the wicked will act wickedly. So what does he say there?
So many will go through trial by fire, and then the wicked will continue to be wicked.
Yeah.
And the wicked will be very ignorant, and they will not understand what we talk about.
Yeah. So he doesn't give Daniel like a detailed explanation of what the outcome will be, but he does say what Daniel can expect, right? And in general, what's going to expect what can you expect going forward through history?
The faithful will be tried.
Yeah.
And we see this in, I'm going to keep bringing up James, but in the beginning of James, he says, my brothers and sisters, consider it a blessing or joy that you encounter trials and suffering, right?
Yeah. But this is just consistent throughout all history, right? The idea is that the righteous, they're going to suffer. But what's going to be the end result of their suffering? Like, what language does he use there?
They're going to be refined.
Yeah, they're purged, purified, refined. The imagery, like, this is a very positive spin on suffering, right? It does not view suffering as a negative thing. Suffering is a positive thing that it actually strengthens you. And this lines up perfectly well with what we've seen in Daniel, right? Because what have Daniel and his friends gone through in Babylon?
Trials.
Yeah, trials. Literally, his friends quite literally ended up in fire. Yeah, they were quite literally purged. But whenever they came out, they were totally clean, right? And so the idea is what Daniel and his friends went through in Babylon is going to continue being the case going forward, right? The righteous are going to continue to suffer. The wicked are going to continue to be wicked.
It's as if Daniel's friends were the gold that Nebuchadnezzar built the statue passing through the furnace, and they were refined at the end of it.
Yeah. Well, I think that's I think that's probably the contrast going on there. Is that Nebuchadnezzar, he made this statue of gold that was crafted in a furnace, and it shows how weak this is because the gold was malleable, it melted, he molded it into whatever he wanted, and he had the audacity to tell people to bow down before it. You contrast that by these men who worship God, and they were not forged in the furnace. The furnace simply proved that they had already been forged beforehand, right? To where they went in and they did not melt like the gold. Instead, they simply stood there, and in their midst was one like a son of the gods. And they came out, and they didn't even smell like smoke. And so the idea is, what is the better image? It's not the image made by man, it's the image of God, right? And that would be those who worship him. And so the guy tells Daniel that going forward, if you want to know the outcome, the faithful are going to suffer, but it's going to be good for them. And then the wicked are going to continue to be wicked. And again, this is very similar to what Jesus says he says, you're going to hear of wars and rumors of wars. But he says, see that you are not alarmed, for those things must take place, and that is not yet the end. And I always find it funny whenever people talk about that verse, because people will look at the world around them and they'll be like, oh my gosh, have you looked at the news? There's all these wars going on. That must mean Jesus is coming back soon. Whereas what Jesus literally says is, that's what you can expect going forward. He's saying the same thing the angel's saying here, right? The righteous are going to suffer, and the wicked are going to be wicked. That's what you can expect. In the midst of that, none of the wicked will understand, but those who have insight will understand. And so, it seems like this is the same two categories, right? The wicked are the ones who are acting wickedly, and they will not understand what Daniel has been saying in the book. By contrast, there's those who have insight, and those would run parallel to the people who are being purged, purified, and refined, right? And so, again, this calls back to chapter 11, where there were these people during the Maccabean time period, who instead of fighting back, they just suffered unto death, right? So the martyrs, right? The martyrs, they will have insight, and they will understand, and I think the way that they understand is that rather than responding to all this persecution like the Maccabees did, they respond like Daniel and his friends did, right? And they are faithful unto death. Because keep in mind, Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were not guaranteed to be delivered, right? God did miraculously deliver them, but they did not go into that knowing they were going to come out the other end, right? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, we could, but we don't know if we will. And so there is a legitimate thing where, you might suffer unto death. But you go back to verse 2, those who are in the dust of the ground will awake. And so that's why they're willing to go through with this. But, verse 11, from the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. And so this is where he does give the answer to what the guy asked in verse 6, right? How long will it be? Well, earlier he said times half a time, and now he just puts it in a different terminology, right? And he tells us exactly what this is referring to, right? So it's not saying from the time Daniel has the vision, it's from the moment the abomination of desolation is set up. But that's interesting, because if you go to chapter 11, who is it who set up the abomination of desolation?
Antiochus.
It was Antiochus Epiphanes. But in this chapter, we're not talking about Antiochus Epiphanes. We're talking about the king who came after him.
The Antichrist.
Yes, which is like the Antichrist. But what's interesting here is that you have this double prophecy. Because Antiochus Epiphanes, he set up an abomination of desolation, and it, 3.5 years later, the Maccabees kicked it, won the battle. And so it was literally 3.5 years. However, when you get to Jesus in Matthew 24, he says that there is still going to be a future abomination of desolation, right? And I think that that's how you get there, right? Jesus, he knew the Bible. Shocker. It's almost like he's the one who inspired it. But whenever you look at this, it's a very confusing passage, because if you go to chapter 11, it was a different king altogether who set up the abomination of desolation. But now it says, okay, well, once the abomination of desolation is set up, 3.5 years. And so you get the idea that there's going to be multiple abominations of desolations that are set up in temples. And in general, it's going to be a 3.5 year time period. And sure enough, that is what happened with Antiochus, and it's going to happen again, as best we can tell. I don't even know what to do with verse 12, I'm going to be honest with you. How blessed is he who keeps waiting and reaches the 1,335 days?
Okay, so that's 45 days after the abomination of desolation is set up. What do we do with that? Which would correspond to roughly a month and a half.
Correct.
No clue. It's not for us to know.
Yep, I have no idea. I'm assuming it's just the idea, when it says how blessed is he who makes it, I think it's because, keep in mind, what happens at the end of the 1,290 days, according to verse 7?
The shattering people.
Yeah, the people are shattered. And so I think the idea is that at the end of the 3.5 years, the holy people are at their lowest. And so I think that at the bare minimum, what he's saying is, blessed are those who make it through that, and they live till afterwards, right? And so I think he just goes another month and a half afterwards. I don't know the significance of 45 days. I don't know, maybe if you go back to something, there could be another story in the Bible where 45 days was significant. I don't remember how long it was that the water was receding during the flood. I probably go look into it. It rained for 40 days and 40 nights. I don't remember how long it receded for, but the general idea is that at 1,290 days, they're at their lowest point. But what did God's, like, what's going to happen immediately after that? Like, we looked at 3 prophecies where somebody's hands up to the heavens. What does God promise He's going to do?
He's going to save them.
He's going to save them and rescue them, right? And so they're rescued at the end of 3.5 years. And so blessed are those who make it to the end after that, right? So the idea is that not everybody's going to be martyred. There are going to be people who do survive this. And so there's an extra blessing on those. And when you get to Revelation, you see the same thing, right? There are people who are martyred, but there's also people who make it to the end. And they, like whenever Christ sits on his like millennial throne, there are people there who they made it to the end and they did not suffer unto death.
It was 150 days.
Which is way more than 45. So, yeah, I have no idea. But verse 13, final verse. But as for you, go your way to the end. Then you will enter into rest and stand again for your allotted portion at the end of the days.
So he's essentially promising Daniel he's already saved.
Yeah, which, I mean, none of
I
us
think
have
he's
any doubt.
also telling him that just.
Which none of us had any doubt, but it's still pretty cool just to hear that. Right?
Yeah.
Just to have that much more information.
Yeah. But it is a very interesting way to close the book. I think it's a beautiful way. But basically he is, Nick, what did you just say?
So he's basically telling him to go die.
Yeah, that's what I thought you said.
Like
Um,
in a much nicer way than just
yeah.
being very blunt and saying
Yeah.
pass away.
Well, like, that is basically what he's saying, but I kind of love it.
Rest
Because,
in peace.
In many ways, this is kind of like Daniel's version of, like, well done, good and faithful servant.
Mhm.
Right? Daniel, he has been here the entire time. Right? He has lived a long life, and in many ways, his life has been a living sacrifice. To where our impression of Daniel is that he has been a faithful Jew through and through his whole life, yet he has been living in a foreign land as a result of the sin of his ancestors. And through all of this, he has suffered, he has been exalted, he has seen kingdoms rise and fall, and now here he is at the end of his life, and he sees that things are going to get rough, and it's going to get bad. But then this final verse, like Daniel's like, what's going to happen? I want to know more. And the guy says, it's not for you to know. Daniel, your job is done. You can close the book. You've done your job. You've made it to the end. You've done the task given to you. Go to your appointed end, and you will enter into rest and stand again for your allotted portion at the end of the days. So the idea is that he will die, but he will join in that future resurrection, and he will have everlasting life. And like that is such a cool way to end the book. Like that is like that's it's so satisfying.
It's such a the one thing I've appreciated most about going through the book is how good of a storyteller Daniel is.
He's a
And
great
just, like,
story. Yeah.
In the amount of narrative that he can pack into these 12 chapters and to have it end with such finality, it puts like every TV finale to shame.
Yeah, it really does.
It's
And
awesome.
honestly, I would say it's not even just Daniel. Like, the Bible's like that consistent. Like, it genuinely amazes me, even as we've been going through Genesis in the podcast. I know Sean's asleep over there. But, as we've been going through Genesis in the podcast, it amazes me how much the Bible packs into just such a little, like, amount of stuff. Like, I don't know. It's funny because I read all sorts of books, right? And I love reading long books. You know, like, I love me a good Brandon Sanderson book, which is just, like, 2,000 pages long. But the thing is, like, the stories are so long and drawn out to where, like, some pages just nothing will happen. Whereas when you read the Bible, it's like there is so much packed into every single little thing here. To
I
where
mean, there are some stretches where you're getting like the exact building measurements of a temple.
well, yeah, because and that's because there's different genres in the Bible. To where some of it is literally just like architectural blueprints. But I'm talking about like the narratives themselves, right? The narratives and the prophecies, they fit so much in there where it's like it really is a literary masterpiece. Like that's like I don't know. Like I've tried comparing it to the other ancient stuff. Like whenever you read like the Enuma Elish and stuff, it's not the same. Like that stuff is just like it reads like a modern person just like writing a fantasy story or something like that. Whereas it really is impressive how Daniel writes. But yeah, what are y'all's thoughts? One other thing I want to highlight. Just I had a suspicion it would be this word. When it says you will enter into rest, that is the word nuach, which is from Genesis. Like whenever Noah is called, like his name Noah means rest because his father prophesied and said this one will bring us rest, and he was wrong, kind of. Noah did bring rest to the land. Well, I think the dad said he will bring rest to the land which God has cursed, right?
Yeah.
And so technically Noah did that, but it came at the cost of every human life. And so it wasn't exactly how the dad anticipated. But now this angel is inviting Daniel to enter into rest. And I just think that's kind of cool. And it lets Daniel know that his name is written in the book of life, which is cool. And it's also like the same word whenever the ark rested on Ararat. And so I just think that's kind of cool. Do you have any thoughts? I mean, I can probably talk about verse 13 for another 2 hours, but it's already 9:06. So do y'all have any thoughts y'all want to share?
Going into Ezekiel from this is going to be a trip.
It's going to feel like an acid trip is what it's going to feel like.
That's how Daniel probably felt throughout the last few
Yeah.
chapters.
I wonder if anybody's ever studied Ezekiel while on acid. They thought it was just a normal book. They just read it. They just thought, oh, that's just a
story.
They just thought they were reading like Tale of Two Cities or something. That's funny. They're like, that's not crazy. But okay, just final application point, just to reflect on this, like with verse 13. I talked about how like this is kind of Daniel's version of like, well done, good and faithful servant. I think it'd be great if for all of us, like this is the type of greeting, like this is how we could be at the end of our lives. To where, I mean, I'm not saying that we all need an angelic visitation where an angel discloses to us the next 400 years of human history, but I'm saying like just the notion of being at the end of your life, knowing that you have faithfully done what God has called you to do. And not everybody is called to be a Daniel who goes and, predicts the next 400 years of history and is a satrap in charge of a powerful empire. Not all of us are called to be that. Not all of us are called to be Davids. Not all of us are called to be Abrahams. Some of us are called to just be like the people who were servants of Abraham who were never even mentioned in the story. We're not all called to be like the main characters of the story, but we are all called to be faithful. And I don't know. I just like the idea of like, I don't know, reaching the end of your life and being content knowing that like, I don't know, there's so many other characters in scripture and in history who, when they reach the end of their life, they have all these regrets. And I can't help but think like David, man after God's own heart, but when you get to the end of his life, he's filled with all sorts of like, I don't know, regrets over what he's done and remorse and guilt. Whereas I feel like he wouldn't feel the peace that you can see Daniel has in this moment. I guess we don't know that Daniel feels it, but that's at least what the angel's communicating to him. But I don't know, I just like the idea of reaching the end of your life and knowing that you have been faithful, to where, hypothetically, if an angel were to show up to you and talk to you, he would say, as for you, go your way to the end, you will enter into rest and stand again for your allotted portion at the end of the day. So like that's a cool thing for all of us to aspire to. So that whenever we are old and gray, it'd be good for us to look back on life and say, all right, I have reached my appointed end. Time to go to the dust. I'll wake up when it's time.